Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Byington, and in this video, we're going to be doing a quick coverage of William Blake's work. In this PowerPoint video, I'm going to be covering two works from his two poetry collections, The Lamb from Songs of Innocence and The Chimney Sweeper from Songs of Innocence. And then those both have their own respective contrasting poem, The Tyger from Songs of Innocence and of Experience, as well as the other version of The Chimney Sweeper in Songs of Innocence and of Experience. So as far as William Blake's biography goes, one of the most important things you need to know about him is that he's not just a writer, he is also known for his artworks. He worked as an engraver, and let me go ahead and give you an example here. So here is the illustration that accompanies his poem, The Lamb, in his poetry collection, Songs of Innocence. And I say that it accompanies The Lamb, but it actually doesn't just accompany it, it basically lives, it coexists with the poem on the page. This is sort of like what you see in children's books, but his poetry wasn't intended for an audience of children. His work, his artwork, his poetry is living in the same space as his artwork. One informs the other. So you see how you have this nice gentle scene of a little boy kind of feeding the lambs, or maybe he's going to pet it. Whereas I'm going to move on to the other example here, the tiger. It's just sort of here. It has a kind of wild look in its eye. That's because you'll see when we get to the tiger, one of the themes of the tiger is the sublime. That's a significant theme throughout the Romantic period. We will talk about that when we get there. Back to the biography. You'll see this with not just Blake, but some of the other writers we cover in the Romantic period. Even though they are some of the most anthologized writers in English literature, people like William Blake, John Keats, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, they didn't have extreme fame and success in their own time. Maybe Mary Shelley differs from the rest of them because later in her life, once she again outlives Percy Shelley's negative reputation and the debt that he left her in, she does succeed. But the others, like William Blake, were only a few copies of these poetry collections. The Norton Anthology states in William Blake's biography that there were only about 28 copies of Songs of Innocence and of Experience collectively. So he wasn't a big will-to-do in that sense of being a writer. While he was able to provide for himself and his wife, Catherine, modestly, they weren't super well off. In an earlier part of their life together, they financially struggled as well. After his death, though, that's when people kind of recognize that this was groundbreaking. This was unlike anything else being created in that time. So the two poetry texts I've already mentioned, Songs of Innocence, and just like its name suggests, there is a sort of gentleness and vulnerability to the situations in those poems in that collection. And look, it's only about 5 years later, Blake adds to that. And your Norton Anthology explains that he and his wife painstakingly stitched this new collection of poems of experience onto those that he had printed of Songs of Innocence. And so it becomes a sort of, you might call it a conflated edition. So it's the Songs of Innocence, but then he's added more to that. And experience might be a little more ambiguous than the term innocence, but you see, especially with the second chimney sweeper poem, how much more serious and not jaded, not looking at the world through rose tinted glasses, those poems of experience are. So let's look at the lamb first. The lamb expresses a lot of that sort of the religious vibe that Blake often contributed in his work. So something you might look at here is some of the language. It is, as you see in the bullet point I have here, we have all that gentleness that I mentioned earlier, the softest clothing, woolly, bright. So the lamb is really soft to touch. Now, the lamb, besides being associated with Christianity and Jesus Christ, if you look at the most common types of animals that might be printed on children's clothing or be a stuffed animal. A lamb would probably be up there, if not in the top 10, just right under it, because it's a soft, cuddly thing. It's not scary or dangerous like the tiger. So, one of the questions that Blake brings up is, dost thou know who made thee, gave thee life, and bid thee feed? So he is asking, like, do you know who made you, little lamb? And he goes on to say that it's God and it's the Holy Trinity. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself the Lamb. He is meek and he is mild. So the lamb, he's talking about God or the Holy Trinity. The lamb is a byproduct of all these things created on earth. A similar situation is seen in Blake's poem, The Tyger. Okay, so now we are in songs of innocence and of experience. So it's much more serious. Tyger, Tyger, burning bright, in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? So it's addressing that it is a godlike entity. So what God could frame thy fearful symmetry? It's fearful, it's dangerous, but it's also symmetrical, meaning that it's aesthetically pleasing. This is the idea of the sublime that I mentioned a moment ago. So, in the sublime, something is both wildly beautiful, unbelievably breathtaking, but it's also very dangerous. So, the tiger kind of fits that. It's very pretty to look at, but if you don't want to be stuck in a room like without a trainer or a handler with a tiger, right? It might be a scary situation. You don't know what would happen because it's a wild animal. So that is the element of the sublime. Also, when we're talking about these two different spaces and songs of innocence and then songs of innocence and of experience. We go from the lamb to the tiger and things are now more serious. You think about the food chain, which of the two would eat the other? If you lock a lamb and a tiger in the room, the tiger would probably eat the lamb, right? So it's this beautiful thing that can destroy innocence. So it functions as a metaphor for that. In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? The whole poem, unlike the lamb, spends a lot more time asking what made the tiger. So how did the same God that made such this small, sweet, gentle lamb also create this vicious tiger? And it gets more specific. So we go from this sort of ethereal space, like on what wings dare he aspire, of where this tiger is being crafted. And now we're talking about literally making the tiger bit by bit. and what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart. So it's like from the moment that the tiger is being made, we're talking about every little cell in its body and the sinews of its heart. And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? So the moment that it exists, he's saying it's a big stalking predator. It has the dread hand and dread feet. So the stalking on the 4 feet of the paws of the tiger. What the hammer, what the chain, and what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? So the hammer and the chain and what furnace was thy brain, you can think of this as almost like the forging of weapons. Like if you've ever seen in movies or TV shows or in real life, like a sort of demonstration where they'll take it's metal making, blacksmithing tools or weapons, let's say like a sword. And so they have to put it in the fire, the furnace was thy brain, and then they keep hitting it with the hammer. They beat it with the hammer until it reaches that perfection, or it's a step away from perfection, and they go on to finish the process. So it's like it has been crafted as if a weapon. And then we end in the final stanza with the same question again, but just a little bit different in tone now. Because now we didn't go, excuse me, now we are saying, what immortal hand or eye dare, the word is, one word is different, dare frame thy fearful symmetry. We started out by asking, like, how was it possible for a godlike entity to create this thing? Now it dares to create this thing.